joining us. We kind of model these Asian legal network events after kind of the notion of a study group, which is popular in Asia, as you know. The notion of companies coming together for dinners, for meals periodically, to often competitors coming together to talk about the common issues that they have in their industry. That whole notion of collaboration, which is very healthy, to be able to air issues and be able to solve issues together, is something that we try to push forward. We started the Asian Legal Network as a way of extending the legal network that exists in Europe, the U.S., parts of Latin America, that was designed to bring people together to really discuss best practices and share best practices in terms of open source legal issues on both the patent and the copyright side. And so that entity I would invite you to participate in. It's the legal network now is very global, and in part because of the many events that we've had in various parts of Asia. And now there's an annual event that actually takes place in Barcelona once a year in April, where there are anywhere from 100 to 140 practicing attorneys from different companies around the world. Huawei has been there many different years as one of the longer-standing open source participants in China. And so it's a great opportunity for us to be able to engage and to respond to questions. If questions don't come today, then coming at another time. We like to connect up people with that are facing challenges about how you kind of move from a proprietary world to an open and closed world, and the legal challenges that are associated with that, from intellectual property codification and utilization and licensing activities. We want people across the world to be working from the same knowledge base. And so it's been very important, and it's been very rewarding for us, because we've seen over the last 6 years of doing this, we've seen incredible growth in Asia and in China, very particularly in the adoption of open source technology and the participation in open source projects. For many years, Huawei was alone as a participant in Linux Foundation projects, but now all the bats are all involved in open source and utilizing open source in a significant way. And so it's a great time for us to have these kinds of conversations, because the issues that you face are ones that in some environments other people have faced. And so sharing ideas, there's a parallel activity that takes place between what happens in the technology world in terms of collaborative development and what's taking place now in the legal community. And that's a very positive thing, because we want, as I said, we want everyone to be able to not have barriers to the utilization of open source, be they technical or legal. So with that, I'll start and talk a little bit about patent non-aggression and really lay the context out for the world that we live in. And sometimes when we have our heads down, it's difficult to see how things have changed over the last particularly 15 or 20 years, but the last 5 years, I think, most acutely in Asia. Software obviously is rising. Hardware is in decline. In fact, there are very, very few companies that define themselves as or describe themselves as hardware companies. Even if there's a small component of software that they have in their businesses, they tend to kind of think about that as being the future of how they're going to be developing their businesses and growing. The diversity of thought that comes from participation in open source projects, and there are hundreds of open source projects producing millions of lines of code a year. The diversity is really where the power of this is. Open source, in some senses, is defined by this notion of collaborative development, where 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, it equals 6 or 10 or 20, when we bring smart people from around the world together to solve technical challenges. And it allows us to innovate at much higher levels, to lower cost, to do much more iteration. If you look at traditional pre-smartphone market, and the number of upgrades that would be done, and the cycles. Things have moved dramatically with not only with Android, which is a platform that runs on the Linux kernel, but also with iOS, which is a platform that runs on open source code, even though it's not built on the kernel. It originally was, and then it was transformed into a proprietary company by Apple after purchase. And so this is just an example of some of the projects that the Linux Foundation manages, and many of these are critical to Chinese companies. The networking companies that are China Mobile and other users of this code that comes out of OPNFV and the Open Daylight and the three other, ONAP is another. There have now been 5 independent projects that have been combined under one heading into a super project dealing with development of technology to be able to support the regeneration of mobile and wireline networks around the world. Clearly in the U.S., AT&T is one of the major drivers behind these projects, but these are very much global projects, not the province of any one country or region of the world. These technologies are, and as by design, being used by many companies in many geographies. Projects that are particularly important to us because of what they portend. The Hyperledger project supports blockchain technology. It's had its second code release just a short while ago. It's a very exciting project, and a lot of the code that's been released already is being incorporated into banking systems. Code is already being used here. I mean, you have one of the more sophisticated payment systems in the world with Alipay and with WeChat Pay, so that you, in some sense, bypass the error. It makes it difficult for tourists because if we don't have Didi and we don't have one of those 2 payment platforms, we're kind of having to carry around cash. But that's a good thing for your economy and a good thing for lifestyle to be able to do that. So it's a great benefit. And so the creative use of these technologies is not something that where any of the traditional kind of G6 countries, G8 countries have had any province of uniqueness. I think disintermediating the SWIFT system, being able to do some things that were thought 5 years ago thought impossible, that are happening here are fantastic, and to be able to maintain secure transactions while disintermediating SWIFT, because SWIFT has been basically a cause for, I think, 5 different independent hacks over the last 2 years. It's clearly not working, and so they're looking to revive SWIFT. They're trying to use Hyperledger code as well. Cloud, what's happening on the cloud side, obviously the growth in the cloud, and whether through its Cloud Foundry or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation or OpenStack, these are major projects that are all supporting kind of this whole notion of expansion of opportunities for us to run thin client devices and keep our data in the cloud. So there's a concept it comes out of game theory, and it was very popular in the mid-90s. It's the whole concept of co-opetition, where we cooperate and compete. That's really what happens in open source. There's this notion that there's interdependence, and I think it's very healthy because we tend to sue each other less when we recognize our fortunes rise and fall to some degree with our competitors. It's not just a zero-sum game, but we need to cooperate and compete at the same time. And so that's a very common activity. Think about Linux. Linux is probably very poorly marketed because most people don't realize that every electronic touch we have is enabled by Linux. Stock exchanges all around the world. I was in Bombay last year and shouldn't have been, but was surprised to find out that for 8.5 years now, the Bombay Stock Exchange has been running on Linux. And that's, it's far-flung places all around the world are running Linux because of its ease of use and its availability. and the value that it provides when not having to recreate platforms from the ground up. So pretty much everything we do, all the searches that we do, stoplights, air traffic control systems, as I said, the cloud, the autonomous vehicles are going to be utilizing, the platforms are all for autonomous vehicles are running open source, but also the Hyperledger technology is being looked at by the European Union as a regulatory tool, so that for every activity from point A to point B will be tracked by a Hyperledger, so that there's a record, an inalterable record of exactly what's transpired. And this will be made popular by the use of Hyperledger and ledgering technology that comes out of blockchain. In this context, OIN was formed 13 years ago. I think there was an awareness that something was happening that was going to be very significant. Open source has been around, Linux has been around for 29 years, and open source a little bit longer than that as a broader concept. But it's really only been in the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years that we've seen this incredible expansion. When OIN was formed, it was largely that Linux was used in the enterprise, and there was some thought that it would be the Linux desktop would be really powerful. That hasn't come to pass, but that's about the only thing that hasn't shifted to Linux that's software centric. In the beginning, you had SUSE, which was Novell at the time, Red Hat, Sony, IBM, NEC, and Philips. Since then, because of the equities involved in the important platforms of Chrome and Android, Google has become a participant. Everything Google does runs on Linux. All their self-driving, everything, that's the starting point for every platform that they develop. Magenta and the other new platforms that you'll hear about, they're all running on Linux as well. There is some talk that a new kernel could be developed by Google. They're so active with Linux and with open source. Toyota, because of automotive-grade Linux, became a participant and a funding member in June of 2016. We are very much by design a global organization. 3/8 of our members are Japanese, and we'd like to see, quite frankly, we'd like to see a Chinese company over the next couple of years become a participant on our board to show the rise of technology utilization, and particularly open source software here, and to have that representation we think is important because of the position of not just nationally but globally of Chinese technology companies. And the thought was originally that patents could be used to slow or stall the progress of Linux. So let's create a platform that allows for us to kind of buy into this idea of co-opetition, so that we can, basically the model is where we are working together to build on each other's ideas, we shouldn't sue each other, because that's the fundamental technology we want to be able to repurpose in the products that we produce. And we utilize them in different ways, so competitors are not producing necessarily the same product, but they're leveraging common code at the core to be able to build up different application level differentiation in their products as they put things out into the marketplace. OIN has quietly become the largest patent non-aggression community in the history of the technology world. We have 2,600 plus participants. We started out slowly. The first 3 years, I think we had 31, but then the world changed, and we've taken advantage of the fact that of the great proliferation of open source technology. The companies that are members of our community of licensees own over 3 million patents. We own over 1,300 global patents and applications ourselves. We invent on a regular basis, some years well in excess of 100 applications. We curate our portfolio. We provide access to our portfolio to companies that are at risk or in litigation, from companies that are looking to slow or stall the progress of Linux by utilizing their patent portfolio. And we have a very broad range of very significant companies that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward. The mission of OIN is to support freedom of action and freedom to operate in the core. so that you can make choices and feel very comfortable building around open source technology. That's one of the fundamental tenets of the social order of what open source is, because at its core, open source is a social movement. It's not really just about technology. And that's why it's an irreversible trend, because social movements are very, very hard to thwart. You can't just basically introduce an alternative technology and say, oh, well, we're going to do a workaround. It's not about a workaround. It's a way of creating value in the new economy. And we're all part of this great, wonderful kind of experiment of collaborative development, because we all participate in the digital era. The cost, this is another component that's quite unique about OIN, is it's free. For many years, I ran a technology fund focused on IP as an asset class, and I was measured on a quarterly basis on return on capital. Now I'm measured by the lack of something. If there's no litigation related to Linux system or Linux kernel functionality, I'm considered to be being successful. It's a very different model. It's really an alternative return fund, if you will. Its capital's been put in. Right now we have about $70+ million in capital that we use to be able to buy patents that clear the way in front of Linux to be able to participate in broadening the license so that more and more companies participate and more risk is reduced. The non-financial obligations are straightforward. Again, that whole concept of where we're collaborating, the core technology that we're producing, and where we're building on each other's ideas, we don't sue each other. You participate in a cross-license. You agree to cross-license patents that you have that read on this core Linux functionality area, or the Linux system, as we describe it. And in return, you're able to get a cross-license from everyone. You get a license from other people who participate. So the other 2,600 plus companies are in the cross-license as well. And that Linux system definition is very important. It's one of the most important things we do. And in order to do it, we maintain extensive outreach. It takes us the neighborhood of 2 years, 2.5 years to do a Linux system update, because we want to make sure that we're incorporating code from significant projects, and we're keeping the Linux system definition quite narrow. In addition, we are providing a free license to the 1,300 patents and applications that we have. We've spent $100 million buying and curating our patent portfolio, and we're making that available on a royalty-free basis. Two things that are really going on here. One is a cross-license that's completely tied to the Linux system and Linux functionality. The other is patents that we own are not necessarily related to Linux. They relate to the open source opportunities that Linux creates. So we have patents in a whole variety of areas, from mobile communications, security, banking, financial services, where open source can be used. We're looking at populating the area and doing clearance in front of where Linux is going in some of these major projects. At the same time, we're buying patents that have observable infringement reads on companies that have been known to be antagonistic to Linux. And so we have assets that we warehouse that companies can use to be able to support counterclaims in the event that they're attacked by operating companies. We are also, on occasion, $15 million of the $100 million that we spent on acquiring assets has been spent on non-practicing entity troll interdiction. We'll buy them out from trolls or prevent them from ending in the hands of trolls. And so while that's not the main focus historically, because of the success of open source, there are fewer and fewer enemies that are operating companies, and there are more patents that are concerning that are held by patent trolls, non-practicing entities. And so you can expect that we will be allocating more capital going forward to be able to neutralize risk. And we're not just looking to neutralize risk in the U.S. We're looking to neutralize risk around the world. We have JPO patents, we have Chinese patents, we have European patents, and they're not just foreign counterparts. We'll buy Chinese patents because of the rise, obviously, of filing and the level of litigation here. This has become a very important area for us, and so we're actively looking One of our acute points of focus is Chinese patents and German patents. German patents because of what we expect in the future will be a more litigious environment with the unitary patent and unified patent system. The makeup of the Linux system, where we pull code from to put into the into this this core that we have, which is the patent no-fly zone, or defines the scope of the cross license. And we work very closely with projects, the Linux Foundation being one of the major managers of significant projects. They have a very international board. Tencent's the most recent member of their board. Google's on their board. Fujitsu, Hitachi, many companies, NEC, AT&T. And by design, we live in the slipstream of these projects. They form a project. It's an important project in an important area, and we will work with them and work with the managers of the project, the technology leads, and the companies in those projects to make sure that the Linux system definition development process is informed by the perspective of these particular companies. And again, this idea of the parallel between technical collaboration and legal collaboration. In fact, the OIN is so integral to what the Linux Foundation does that they made an explicit decision a little over 10 years ago that they were actually going to be very active, and not just they are the host of Linux, which is the largest project in open source by far. But they made the decision that they wanted to take a strategic stand and be a project manager, because before that it was really just Linux. And since then they have had probably 140 projects that they've started and now manage. But they decided that they would not use on the copyright side, that they would not use the GPL, and that they would instead use use permissive licenses. And almost all their projects are done under the Apache license. And they do that recognizing that there is, and Benjamin will talk a little bit more about this later, but there's a relatively weak patent protection in permissive licenses historically. Apache's probably the better of the permissive licenses in terms of even addressing the issue of patent obligations and de-risking for participants. Their patent risk. And so this is something that they counted on. OIN, the head of the Linux Foundation, and I sat together, and he talked about this plan, and he said, we know that we're not going to get the same patent protection that we'd like to have, but the reason that they use this permissive license, because there are very few barriers. Patents can become, as people around this table understand, can become polarizing elements that stall or slow the ability to actually move forward with technical development. Can also be an enabler, but very often early when you're forming a project, you don't want to have very many, if any, issues that really need to be addressed. You want to be able to get to the business of collaboration, of supporting supporting kind of the co-development of technology. And so as a result, they made a decision that they would have very light touch, non-threatening, non-controversial intellectual property patent clause associated with their license under which the project is carried out. And they've counted on OIN to provide true patent support and risk mitigation as a partner in these activities. And so it's been a very explicit connection between us and some of the major project management organizations and major projects. This gives you a sense of kind of how we think about some of these most important projects are that we look to support. These are not the only projects we support. We support literally dozens of projects, but this is just an example of some of the life cycle and the importance and the maturity of some of the projects. Obviously, Linux is the most significant, as I said, 29 years old. Android's much newer, much younger. Android Chrome, OpenStack, the Open Container Initiative, automotive grade Linux, the full suite of 5 network projects, which ONAP and OPNFV are kind of the major ones, Hyperledger, and most recently LF Energy. The energy project is a really interesting one. I've met with power companies in Asia, in the U.S., and in Europe to talk about the opportunities to re-architect their networks, and I've been talking about that for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's not surprising to me that a project's been launched that is now bringing together power utilities from all around the world to be able to work on re-architecting their networks to make them more efficient and allow power to be moved on and off the grid more seamlessly. And that's particularly popular as a concept in Europe. The U.S. doesn't have a grid that's architected very much to allow movement of power from the edge back to the core. But that this will work on some aspects of making that possible. This is a sense of the timing where we think where these projects reach a point of sophistication and inclusivity to make companies more receptive to thinking about not only participating in those projects but participating in OIN and recognizing at these particular junctures the companies participate in these projects recognize how important it is to have risk mitigation associated with patents because open source becomes incredibly relevant to them. They recognize that their fortunes and their technological development roadmaps are explicitly tied to what happens with open source development in these open source projects. This is just an example of representative licensees from around the world. Clearly, many of the major automakers, Volvo being Photon, Volvo, a couple of other Chinese companies are part of this community. We are looking to include more as we go forward. We're rounding up the French and the Italian companies now as well. We expect them to be joining as well as the remaining German companies that haven't joined. Daimler clearly is the European leader in technology and was an early signatory. On the carrier side, SK, Vodafone, Verizon, AT&T, KDDI, Reliance, which is the combined Reliance is the largest carrier in the world. And so Flipkart, JD.com, many companies that are very well known in Asia are part of our community. And again, that's by design, wanting to ensure that we have a global mix. And NTT is about to join. As I said, several other car companies are moving in that direction. And we really play we're a strategic guardian of kind of this way of creating value and thinking through the next generation technologies. We, again, by design, it's not an accident that I spend about 60% of my 260 days on the road in Asia. I've been doing this for, I'd say probably since we started the Asian Legal Network, 6 to 7 years, spending a lot of time in Asia, North Asia, here, and it's primarily 3 or 4 countries that you spend most of your time in because that's where technological development is advancing the most rapidly in terms of open source, and where open source, I think, is going to have the biggest overall play over time. And so 39% of our community is from Europe, Middle East, Africa, 24% here in Asia, and 37% from the U.S. We expect that we're going to be much closer to 30, 35, 30, somewhere in that range over the next 5 years as we move forward. And my goal all along has been to have 30% Asian participation. We do a broad range of other things. We buy patents. We transfer patents to companies at risk or in litigation. We are very active in pre-issuance submissions. We're the largest filer in the U.S., utilizing the American Invents Act to erode the opportunity for growth of poor quality patent portfolios that could be damaging to Linux and open source and choice. That's really what we're focused on. We are very supportive of the patent system. We believe it still is an important pathway to innovation and a way of protecting assets. But at the same time, we recognize that there's a lot of poor quality patents out there, and we want to be able to use the tools that exist now in the U.S. and those that exist around the world ultimately to allow us to limit the effect of poor quality patents that ultimately get issued that shouldn't be issued. Because you look at the demands here, I think it's expected that something like 1.9 million patents will be filed by the end of the decade in 2020 or 2021. No one's ever experienced, no country has ever experienced growth in their patent system like this. It puts an incredible burden on examiners. You just can't mint examiners fast enough to be able to do the work. And so, just like in the U.S. during the heyday when it had massive filings, it's just very hard to prevent poor quality patents from getting granted because we only have so much time to focus on reviewing an individual application, and there's only so much access. No matter how much information we make accessible, inevitably there's an asymmetry of information. The patent examiner just can't know everything, and there are ways that we're helping them, and many other companies are helping, and entities are helping as well. So we've done a variety of things. You have access to this deck. And I'm more than happy to provide additional details on some of the things we've done for companies. Normally, when we've intervened, Microsoft has, as an aggressor and an antagonist, because of several litigations they've either funded or directly filed, there's been a very swift positive resolution for the company that's being attacked. And through our activities, as I said earlier, there's been a change in the perspective of many companies, and in a very real sense, OIN is now considered to be a litmus test for the authenticity of companies who participate in open source. If you don't participate, really the only reason you don't is that you want to reserve the right to sue on core Linux, and there aren't many people who answer that question positively. There have been a series of articles written on OIN. I'd encourage you to look at those. And we're also concerned about what's happening in the copyright side. And we've set aside some capital in the event that we start to see any kind of aggregation of copyrights. There are 134 elements of common code that exist in every instantiation of Linux. And so there are over 1,300 individuals who have the ability to assert that code or to be able to transfer that code. And so what we are concerned about is potential rise of aggregation. Where there's money to be made, there's capital that will line up. And because of the incredible success of open source and because of the vagaries of compliance, compliance is not, as you'll hear later, compliance is not about 100%. It's about efforting in that direction. It's about making an effort every day to be in compliance and doing what's necessary when you're out of compliance to get back in compliance. And there are a number of initiatives there that I think are very important around providing more flexibility to allow people to get back in compliance, giving them a longer grace period so that the license that they operate, that their code is being utilized under is not terminated. And there are a number of reasons why those kinds of programs are very important that I won't go into great detail today, but copyright is very, very important to us because it's the fundamental backbone on which open source projects are run. And as I said earlier, this is not really it's not an either-or situation. It's an open and closed world, and I think it's causing IP directors challenges in terms of where they differentiate, how they can differentiate, how patents can be used to support that differentiation. And this idea of co-opetition is not again the demise of IP, but rather it creates new opportunities for us to have more streamlined portfolios that really are about differentiation and not just about largesse. I think we've gone through periods, and the U.S. has been very guilty of this, is, as well as other countries. But, I think we set a tone because of our history with inventing, and we've created very bloated portfolios that are very expensive, that are a drag on profitability when we could be more precise. And I think we're being forced to because of the cost of maintaining these portfolios, but also because of the difficulty of getting granted patents. What is patentable subject matter has changed in the U.S., and I expect that there'll be changes around the world as well. So again, to close out my comments, the bottom line is that when open source is something that's important to your company and it's relevant, and you're utilizing open source code and you're developing and contributing open source code to projects, that's really the time to spend the time to understand OIN and understand how it basically mitigates risk for you as a company as you participate more extensively in open source projects. So thank you very much, and we are, I would be remiss in not saying that we are very fortunate to have Benjamin here and to have Ant Financial as one of our most recent signatories. Ant is, as you know better than I because you live with it every day, Ant is ubiquitous. Alipay is ubiquitous, and Alibaba as a cousin company is and is an incredible force to be reckoned with. That America is going to have the opportunity to enjoy its services at some point in the not too distant future, and that'll be great because competition from technology leaders is very important. And so I'll pass the presentation deck to Benjamin, and he'll talk about the experiences of utilizing open source technology from a legal standpoint, what those challenges are at a rapidly growing, highly innovative company. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Perhaps Pete, you can answer a few questions before you turn over. Yeah.
Are there any questions that you have? I think I'm to the point where maybe I'm spoiled that when I'm in an Asian environment, I get very few questions. But even though I'd love to have those come, it's, in America you'll be interrupted the whole way through. And in Asia it's very different. There's more contemplation, there's more thought, and then I get a lot of emails. And so I'd love to get emails from you, questions that I can address, concerns, and it doesn't even have to be about OIN. Anything related to legal issues in the community. If you'd like to be connected up with someone, if you have a particular challenge that you'd like to deal with, if there's a counsel you'd like to connect with around the world, we have extensive relationships, and part of our value is serving as a connector of need and opportunity. So if you ever have any question related to open source, feel free to reach out to me, because that's part of what we do. We're a service organization.
I'll make sure I'll ask you questions when I speak. I'm going to stand.
Let's see if we can. What did you see here?
Better, or should I sit down? This is fine. Okay, cool.
I think they might have all been.
It's in one file.
Yeah. I think this is the stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Well, I'm happy to share my thoughts on open source. This is when I'm going to call on Keith to comment on some of these. The one I want you to comment on is all open source licenses require the release of source code for everything. So we'll come to you later, okay? Why do you need to worry about open source? Isn't it free? You can do whatever you want? The answer is absolutely no, okay? So if you heard nothing, you should remember going home. Just because you use open source doesn't mean you don't have liability, okay? And if you look at where the world is going in terms of operating system, there's the Android operating system owned by Google that basically covers 80% of the market worldwide. Then Apple, being the opposite of open source. As you all know, Android is open source based on Linux, as Keith talked about. And Apple, on the other hand, is completely closed. Okay, so you have this world, 20%, 80%. So the 80% is the open source. The 20%, which does really well, probably the only company in the world that's going to do well, which is Apple. After Apple, there will be no another company that's going to be as successful as Apple. Okay, so open source is certainly the trend now and the trend future. So, but open source doesn't mean the source codes are in the public domain. You can do whatever you want. Open source is a license that has conditions. If you meet the conditions, then you get to use their code, perhaps for free, and to serve your needs. If you don't use it the way they impose the conditions, then it's not free. You have liability. Okay, so even if you use open source, you have to worry about legal liability. So, Keith, my first question to you is why this is a big myth?
Yeah, I think many people in the beginning, there's a lot of rhetoric early on that one thing that I found very interesting is that I went back and I looked at IBM's comments about personal computing, and then I looked at the comments of Steve Ballmer and of Gates at Microsoft about what they thought about open source in the mid to late 90s. Hobbyists, never scale, not secure. The idea of shared code does not make sense. Everything they said sounded eerily like what we heard from the comments of IBM as their world was changing. And I think as a testament to them, they recognize that what the real truth is, in which even though they were putting out rhetoric for years, and some of it was just proprietary companies in general. It's not just to pick on Microsoft. And so this concept that you're going to have to give everything away, you'll never be able to differentiate, you can't file any patents. I mean, it's all incorrect because, again, it just creates different challenges for you. And this is, to me, I think, in chaos there's opportunity. I think there's an incredible opportunity for lawyers in companies that are moving increasingly to open source to serve in that bridge function between dealing with the copyrights, understanding among all the hundreds of licenses what code, what you use, what you don't use, what your obligations are. I think it's just a structure. It's a set of rules that once people get their heads around it and we get the right lawyers to help us in these projects, it's not at all as it was depicted in the beginnings of open source or as some of the large companies that were resistant were presenting it. And I think they help perpetrate these falsities because it's also coders don't get the same respect as double E's. I mean, software developers they're like, if you've ever seen rodeo in the United States, it's a strange activity with horses. And anyway, you jump off a horse and you tie the cow's legs and then you raise your hands. That's how a coder is. Whereas a double E is someone who has the sanctity of an engineering notebook, and they're a dream to work with when you're trying to do a filing to do a disclosure because they've got everything orderly. It's just the opposite for this group. And so the fragmented kind of cowboyish culture that around coding, I think, has helped to fuel the notion that it's also unpredictable, and open source is unpredictable and uncontrollable and unmanageable. But it's not the case.
Right. Excellent answer. We have years of experience now looking at open source, and this is why I like to put up all these common myths, which are not true, but here, no one would ever know. Okay. I know you're lawyers here, and if your company uses open source, if you don't understand these are false, I'm sorry, you're not doing your job. Okay, a lot of people say, no one will ever find out. Actually, there's a way to find out if you're using open source now. That's really easy. And it's not enforceable. It is, actually. There hasn't been tons of litigation under open source, but there are people who are successful in terms of enforcing it. And open source is not about copy left, okay? It's just one of the licensing conditions. To me, the most offensive, perhaps this, I'm going to offend someone in this room, the most offensive open source is GPL, which requires that if I combine my proprietary code with the open source code, then I need to basically make my combined code available to the world. Okay, so now you should be really scared in your company if you use anything that's under GPL. You have to think again. Okay, so if you heard nothing, you should go back now to check if you use GPL codes, if your engineers use these. Okay, if they do, you have some cleanup to do. So that's just the scary part of open source, but that's not it. This is a sort of an overview of what open source is. So open source is not about free software that you can just do whatever you want. It's just a bunch of legal conditions that you can and cannot do. I'm not going to walk you through each of them. But here's what I want to talk about. Why do you care? Well, because codes are protected by copyrights and patents, oftentimes open source, any open source licenses comes with a copyright license. Some are broader, some are narrower. At least it has some sort of a copyright license. But some licenses don't have any patent license, meaning it's like the two hands, okay? I can hit you with two hands. I said, okay, I'm not going to hit you with my left hand, but I said nothing about my right hand. The right hand is a patent. I have a million patents I can hit you with. So all I said is I'm not going to enforce my copyright in these licenses. I said nothing about patent licenses. Okay. So to make sure you manage your legal risks, you have to consider both copyright risks and the patent risks. Okay. The same code, as I said, can be protected by copyrights as well as patents. In fact, patents are broader. Okay. It protects the functionality of embodied in the code, not necessarily the code itself. You can use a different code but still infringe the same patent. So that's why, in my view, patents are broader in terms of scope. Now, here's a rough sort of a approximation of what I consider the different kinds of licenses, what I like to avoid or what I like to use. To me, more permissive licenses are more user-friendly. Okay, the copyleft type of licenses are more restrictive. Okay, so this is purely from a copyright law perspective. So you have many different open source licenses, but they're not created equal, just from the copyright law perspective. And what I like is Apache and BSD, as well as MIT. These are the ones I generally am okay when it comes to copyright. But on the other hand, I really don't like GPL or AGPL. And most companies ban their engineers using GPLs or AGPLs. But then I have some data which says contrary things. We'll discuss. Perhaps I'll ask Keith and Jamie why that is, and I don't understand. So I actually I agree with this chart, so I put it up here, and this is how I go by in terms of copyright licenses. Now, okay, coming up this is as of 2013. GPL 2.0 version is the most used open source license, okay? Followed by Apache 2, which makes sense. Apache should be one of the more widely used license, okay? But then followed by GPL 3. So between GPL 2 and 3, they account 50%, I think. And the top 10 accounts for 93%. And top 20 licenses account for 97. So they're predominantly, the top 5 actually is the one I worry the most, okay? Interestingly, between GPL 2 and 3, 50%. Guys have I don't understand.
Well, Linux is done to the GPL too.
Okay.
And so most people, if they do a project, an open source project, the hundreds of projects are done on Linux, where they build on top of Linux. And so because of its ubiquity, that's why you see a tremendous amount of use. I bet these numbers are not, it's not the amount of code that's produced, because the amount of code that's produced, permissive licenses, they have a hockey stick kind of curve, because that's where most code's being produced in the last 10 years.
Okay.
Before that, we had the GPL, and that's what was used predominantly. And because Linux is done into the GPL, that's why these numbers look the way they do.
So you think now, in terms of number of codes, Apache would be number 1?
It's moving in an aggressive way in that direction. But there's still a lot of code produced in Linux.
Yeah.
And so that's why there's always going to be a balance as long as Linux is powerful and important. So there's a lot of code still being produced in Linux every day. It's not a dead project. It's the most prolific project in history. So it skews things.
So basically, if you just take GPL codes without combining it, then your risk is pretty low in terms of...
you can manage Linux. You can manage the GPL. It's just that when you do a new project, as I was saying before, there are barriers to entry that you don't want to have, and that's why, again, the pragmatic discussion that I had 10 years ago with the head of the Linux Foundation, we're not going to do any projects under the GPL because it's polarizing, and we're not going to get any projects off the ground.
Yeah.
So if we want to have successful projects, let's use permissive license.
Yes, right. For example, one issue with GPL is even if you don't combine your code, your source code calls up a GPL code. Is that a problem? There's no legal certainty, okay? The better view is it's not a problem, but there's no guarantee. You see, all these open source issues which have no answer. Now, let's take a look at 2 patent grant clauses. One is for GPL 3. Now, this is where I want to have a discussion with Key. And GPL 3 has a clear, explicit patent grant. So keep in mind, a lot of the open source licenses don't have a patent grant, a license grant. And here there is. It says, each contributor grants you a non-exclusive worldwide royalty-free patent license under the contributor's essential patent claims to make, use, sell, offer for sale, import, and otherwise run, modify, and propagate the contents of the contributor version. This sounds pretty good. I mean, it's pretty broad license. And it doesn't say it's perpetual. Okay. Contrary to Apache 2, which I like better, is the languages track similarly until you get to where such license would apply to patent claims licensable to such contributor who are necessarily infringed by the contribution alone or in combination. Whereas here it doesn't say. So you don't know alone or in combination is implied or not. Okay, but here it's very clear. It's either alone or in combination. That's covered. But what's interesting is, even though it says perpetual, but once you start a lawsuit against anyone else, that license goes away. Okay, so even though it says perpetual, but it's not. But then here, it's not perpetual. So what happens? You also sue another user under this license. What happens? We don't know. You see, this is the problem. Open source licenses are supposed to make life easier and more predictable. But these license terms, some were drafted by lawyers, some were not drafted by lawyers. So it creates all these uncertainty that creates risks for anyone who uses open source. here is a summary of the major open source licenses. And what I can say is, at least when it comes to patent license, GPL3 and Apache 2 has an explicit license. You can debate about the scope of the two licenses and see which one you like better. But at least they are explicit patent license. Whereas under BSD, which is another popular open source license, it's not explicit. Same thing with MIT. Okay. And in terms of rights, they are, and limitations, obligations, they are largely the same. They're not identical, but they're largely the same. But when it comes to patent licenses, it's very different. And with Apache and the GPL being as close a patent grant as you can get. Okay. So then it begs the question that, oh gosh, what if I just use Apache? Am I just in good shape? Well, you're in a better shape than not using Apache, okay? But this only is about contributors' licenses, okay? Even under Apache, everyone who contributed, you get contributors' license. But there are third parties who hold patents. They can still sue you, even if you used Apache 2 or GPL3, right? You think your risk has been decreased? Yes, it's been decreased, but it's not to zero. Of course, nothing will decrease your risk to zero, okay? Maybe your risk is 50%. By using Apache 2, you get down to 30%. Well, how do you get rid of another 20%? It's OIN, which Keith explained. His organization basically grants, once you join, you get a free license to all the members' patents as they relate to the Linux system, right? I didn't mischaracterize it, right? As it relates to the Linux system. So long as you operate in the Linux space, when it's open source, then you reduce, I think, another 20%. But this 10% is always going to be there. No one can reduce it down to zero. But at least you went from 50 to 10%. That's the reason why we joined. And we have lots of open source projects, and not just Linux and non-Linux as well. And so it's, to us, my thought process is what I shared here. It's pretty straightforward. So Keith, now, let me ask you a question. Between these two licenses, which one do you prefer?
I think most people would prefer Apache. Okay. There's teeth to it, but it's not onerous. I think there's concern around the point you made earlier about having to basically open if you marry proprietary and open code, yeah, you have to open that code. You never have the ability to really differentiate. When GPL3 was done, it was a non-starter, yeah, because of this clause. This is one of there are 2 or 3 clauses, but this one in particular is shut down companies like Sony and Philips and other companies who are supporters of OIN, supporters of open source, but because of their licensing businesses, because of their concern around how they differentiate and their commitment to tens of thousands of patents, they have massive portfolios. They said there was no way, and really Intel, all the embedded companies have the same view that they could not participate in the GPL3 project.
Right.
So there are GPL-B3 projects that are being minted all the time. It's just that none of the major technology companies are participating in those projects.
Well, it's my internal conclusion too. So we're gonna participate in Apache 2 as much as we can. The bulk of our projects are Apache 2. With Apache, you get a copyright license, you get some sort of patent license. But then by joining an organization, we joined not just OIN, but some other organizations so that we can further decrease our patent infringement risk. And that's a good thing for our company.
Yeah, and there's some other programs
Yeah.
out there that are complementary. We share DNA with something called LotNet, which is a license on transfer. It's an anti-privateering program at its core, which means you can't put patents out with a third party and then have be suing your suppliers and customers and everything else, which is Nokia is kind of probably the most famous privateer in the last 20 years of doing that on a regular basis. This is a program that lots of companies have joined, some major patent holding companies as well. Canon is a very large patent holding company and was an early participant. And so these programs rise up and they sit complementary. Allied Security Trust, RPX, everybody's trying to reduce risk.
Yeah.
And companies like, there's some companies that are in all of them.
Yeah.
It's just they look for risk mitigation because we're going to spend a little bit here. We're going to risk, de-risk by $3 million, $4 million. We're going to save ourselves one litigation a year, which is it's something that's tangible and something beneficial in a highly litigious environment. It could be really valuable.
Yep.
So.
It's end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for making the time to come in and present. And I know you have a busy schedule getting to Beijing. And
I'll listen to what Jamie.
What we wanted to do now is have Jamie kind of talk. We talk amongst ourselves a lot, and Jamie's been around some of the most significant creative at Sony, some of the most significant creative licensing programs in the world, from MPEG LA to all manner of licensing activities. They've done bilateral agreements that are creative. They've done multilateral, multi-party agreements. And so what we wanted to do is show that the kinds of things we're talking about today are not really aberrant or unusual, but they're really kind of an evolution. The times have changed and the way people collaborate and invent has changed. So we've created alternative approaches to get to the same benefit of how do we reduce risk when we develop products in certain technology areas. And it's an important element of kind of to know where we came from is useful to know where we're going and why solutions like this are practical.
Great. Thank you. I'm Jamie Siegel. I am the head of global licensing for the Open Invention Network. I've been with them for about 2 years now. By way of background, I spent 16 years at Sony, where I was vice president and headed up and managed most of their patent litigations around the world while I was there. I opened up an office in Taiwan for Sony. I was the official representative of Sony Corporation of America to Taiwan. I was also, in my discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about AVS. I was invited as part of the IPR expert group to Beijing, actually my first trip to China, which was about 12 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where we gathered to help write the IPR policy around AVS, which was the first patent pool, first IPR policy around a standard ever adopted in China. As part of that, I was also a member of the executive committee of AVS. I sat on that board representing not just Sony, but a number of Japanese companies that were interested in to see how AVS was going to be implemented as the first Chinese patent pool. Something that since I joined OIN 2 years ago, we've increased our large company membership. And large company we define as over $500 million in revenue with at least 20 patents. Since I've joined, we've increased our large company membership by over 40%. That's a lot. And that's because between Keith and I, together going out and communicating with your internal teams and the internal teams at other large companies, we're able to explain what the benefits are of OIN. And while you heard from both Keith and Ben that OIN is free to join, turns out that selling free is a very hard thing to do. If we were to tell you all that it would cost $5,000 to join, you'd understand that you'd pay and you'd get a benefit. It's a quick trade. But for some reason, when we tell you we're going to give you all those benefits and it costs you nothing, that gets everybody thinking, what's the catch? Why would you do that? And it's a really interesting story because OIN is a very unique organization. And its function, its whole mission is just about making Linux patent aggression free. And on the backs of the endowment by now 8 major companies that endowed OIN with money to operate, we're able to give free licenses. It's really the truest sense of open source in the licensing world as you can get, in that it's free to join. You get to participate. You can come and go as you please. If you decide you don't like it, you can leave. But we've had very few companies in our 15-year history ever leave, because it really is a pretty great benefit. Let's see. All right, we'll just go this way. Or maybe we won't. Okay. So Keith already went through this. We're 2,600 members plus, almost to hit 2,700, probably this quarter. Our members have over 3.6 million patents and applications. The point of that number, and the only reason we put that number up there, is to make everybody comfortable that this is a pro-patent organization, in that we have many of the world's biggest innovators are part of our pool, part of our program. That's not to suggest that you get coverage under 3.6 million patents, because there aren't that many patents that are relevant to Linux or Linux system. But this really sets the tone. These are the leaders of innovation that see value here. Keith touched on, we've had 13 years of experience now, since 2005. Most recently, Toyota joined. Each one of these companies has contributed $20 million to fund OIN. They could have joined for free, but they saw a reason to be leaders, to support the Open Invention Network, which was going to create an environment for Linux and open source to expand and blossom. And that's exactly what's happened. Toyota joined just 2 years ago. In the time that Toyota joined, we've had virtually every major car manufacturer join OIN. On the idea that automotive-grade Linux is so important to the automobile industry. And the same thing that drove the initial group coming together to say that open source is important in electronics, because back then the decision was, do we go with a proprietary solution that's charging us big royalties, where updates are at their discretion, or do we go open source? And the companies, because I was at Sony at that time, so I know what the discussions were. And the discussions were, well, open source was a mystery. We didn't really know what story and what pitfalls open source held. So we didn't want to go down a route of adopting open source, free, which everybody knows isn't really free, and create more risk than we had by paying a big company in Seattle a lot of money for using their embedded software. So the idea around OIN was, let's create this patent non-aggression community that would encourage everybody to join to support the ideal that open source should be open, not subject to perpetual patent lawsuits. And that's what's happened. Linux is everywhere. Open source is everywhere. The idea that we're in this room with one of our most recent members, Ant Financial, that we have in the last couple of months gotten Hire and Meituan and JD.com, And the companies in China are all starting to join. 10 years ago, that would have been undreamed of, that we would have such adoption of open source in China. But that's where we're going. So a lot of my experience comes from patent pools. I sat as the chairman of the board of MPEG LA. How many people have heard of MPEG LA? Who's never heard of MPEG LA?
MP3.
MP3, okay. You know what, is everybody familiar with what a patent pool is? Yes? No? Okay, I'll assume that's a yes. So, patent pools are really a way for patent technology owners to efficiently collect royalties. That's what it's about. They provide knowledge of the costs of adoption, which your business groups it's very important for. The worst thing for business planners is the unknown. You can't plan for the unknown. But if you know how much something costs, you can build it into your model. That's what patent pools do. They use overwhelming force to get compliance. When I was at MPEG LA for, 15 years as a Sony representative, when there were companies that didn't want to take a license, 6 or 7 patent holders would get together and say, well, we'll go assert our patents against that company. And all of a sudden you have 6 or 7 companies asserting essential patents to a standard against one company. And that creates an overwhelming force that forces that company to take a license. That's always the last resort. Patent pools are not, their first goal is not to have patent litigation, but they have the weight of a big, generally a big pool of patents to force compliance, to generate royalties. They promote ubiquitous adoption. Going back to MPEG 2 in particular, MPEG 2, which was the first real patent pool in modern times, was never about generating royalties. Yes, it did generate several billion dollars in royalties, but that's not why it was created. It was created because companies like Sony and Philips and a number of other companies that had key technology around MPEG 2 recognized that unless they gave business certainty as to what the cost would be to use MPEG 2, there would never be widespread adoption. That's why MPEG 2 and MPEG LA was created, to give a certain cost that you could build into a business model. At that time, it was $4 a unit for encoders or decoders. That's a very big royalty. You don't see a lot of royalties these days at that level. And one of the big issues, which we'll talk more about, is reducing patent exposure for the members. So by joining a patent pool, you're getting a license, generally a very efficiently priced license for the number of patents you're getting coverage under, right? You're reducing risk. Anybody in here that's in the legal group, your job is to reduce risk for your clients or to advise your business groups what those risks are so that they can make a business decision, right? So by joining the patent pool, you reduce that risk. At its peak of MPEG 2, there were over 600 patents in the patent pool, 600 essential patents. So for a price of, at that point, it was $2.50 a unit. For $2.50 a unit, you were getting a guaranteed license under at least 650 plus patents around the world if you used MPEG 2 and paid that royalty. It's about risk mitigation. The famous patent pools that most of you may have heard about, MPEG LA, right? Most famous for MPEG 2. Sysvel, well, they've been on all different sides. They've been an aggressor. They've had mixed reviews. But they've also licensed MP3 as a patent pool, right? So they also do patent pools. VIA Licensing, which is Dolby's subsidiary. VIA was a fairly recent, by recent I mean the last 10 years, company that's a subsidiary of Dolby Labs. And they license many patent pools and are a competitor to MPEG LA. Their big pool, they license AAC. That's their biggest pool. AVS. Everybody in this room should have heard of AVS. It was the first patent pool ever in China, Chinese-owned patent pool. That was not a success as a patent pool. Part of the reason was that they were motivated, the executive committee had a lot of influence from the government. Things have changed. Commercial interests have become much more influential in China these days. Back then, 10 years ago, when you have a retired minister on the executive committee, he tends to dictate policy. One of those policies was we shouldn't charge more than 1 RMB for all of the technology in AVS. 6 cents. Or was it? 1 RMB is what, about 12 or 15 cents. The problem with that is that foreign companies in particular that have done technology development, that wasn't enough. In their view, foreign companies did not view that as a fair compensation for their technology use, right? That's the quid pro quo of licensing. Licensing, if you're not an innovator of 100% of technology you use, your quid pro quo, your decision is, I'm going to buy someone else's, the right to use someone else's technology for a price, for a royalty. That's the quid pro quo. Alternatively, you take it and you don't pay, but that's where we have infringement, right? But we try and avoid infringement because that creates risk for big companies, and we don't like risk. HEVC Advance. There's now 3 patent pools around HEVC. MPEG-LA has one. I believe VIA has one. And HEVC Advance has another one. That's very confusing. 3 different pools for the same thing, all charging their own royalties. What's the cost? You could do the math and figure out what that cost is, but now you have 3 different groups you have to pay. The common theme is you have to pay to join a patent pool to get risk mitigation, payment. And that was always a big problem in China, because every pool that I've ever dealt with, and I've dealt with most of the big pools, anytime it came to China, we had to do business in China, the simple fact of the matter was that we were under pressure to give a different royalty rate for China than the rest of the world. Right? So unless there was, if it was $1 the rest of the world, in China, we were under pressure to make it 10 cents. But you were still paying. OIN's mission is a little bit different than a patent pool, which covers those 4 points before. Our mission is really a pure open source mission. We're about making Linux patent aggression free. That's our mission. Join us, don't join us. We prefer you to join us because that makes the community stronger. If you don't join us, well, that's your decision not to join us. I don't understand it. If you don't join us, then, and you come to a decision not to join us, you should let us know why. And maybe it's just a miscommunication. Because from our perspective, it doesn't make any sense not to join us. And we'll talk more about that. So let's compare the differences between patent pools and OIN, because they're very important. Both patent pools and OIN address a known liability, the adoption of some standard. For OIN's perspective, it's Linux, adoption of anything using Linux. Patent pools, it's the specific technology standard that they're pushing, whether it's MPEG-2 or AEC or HEVC, whatever it is. You're addressing that known liability. Cross-license requirements. In patent pools, it's a little bit different. Cross-license requirements in a patent pool, if you read patent pool agreements, what it says is that if you take a license underneath the patent pool, you agree that if you ever assert a patent that is essential to this space of the patent pool that is not in the patent pool, meaning you haven't joined as a licensor, you agree that you will license on terms consistent with the patent pool. Really, if you join a patent pool and you have patents that are essential to the patent pool, you should join the patent pool, because you're not going to get more than you would get through the patent pool anyway. OIN, cross-license requirements, much more direct. We exist, our existence is based on the cross-license requirement. Every one of our members agree that the value they're getting and giving is a cross-license under any patent claims that are essential to the Linux system definition. The Linux system definition is our specification around Linux. It's very low in the technology stack. I could pretty much guarantee that none of your companies are developing that low in the technology stack. You're going to be developing at the application layer where users see your products, not down in the technology stack. Royalty. Well, here's a pretty big difference. For a patent pool, you got to pay a royalty, always. There's no such thing as a free patent pool. For OIN, exact opposite. We're always free. Except for our board members that have paid 20 million bucks to help promote this. We're free. That's a pretty big difference. And that's what makes it really consistent with the issues and the problems that we've addressed that I personally seen dealing with China. It's always been about, well, we don't want to pay a royalty. We want to be able to compete. I remember the conversations on the ABS executive committee when we were debating how much the royalty should be. And the answers we kept getting from Chinese companies and Chinese government was companies should compete on products, not on royalties. Well, that's exactly what OIN does. It fits right into every problem I've heard in China. Additional patent risk mitigation. Well, patent pools are limited to their standard that they relate to. That's it. OIN, on the other hand, we provide a really big benefit that's so much different than anything a patent pool does, because we own our own portfolio of 1,400 patents that are really not related to Linux. They're related to all sorts of technologies around the open source community. They relate to semiconductors. They relate to switches. They relate to biometrics. They relate to mobile phones. They relate to exchange servers. They relate to anything in technology. We probably have a patent that covers it. Blockchain. We have patents on blockchain. If anybody's looking for blockchain, we're actually selling some blockchain patents. We have patents on automotive technology for automotive companies. And our members get a free, royalty-free license for the life of those patents by becoming a member. But it's a little more complicated than that because, remember I said we're free, right? We don't have revenue. Part of our model is that when we have patents, one of the ways we sustain our business is that we sell some of those patents that we own as they get older. We don't sell them to MPEs, we only sell them to companies. But what that means is that that creates an imperative to join OIN, because the sooner you join, the more coverage you get under this patent portfolio that we have. Where I could tell you that I do a lot of the selling for OIN. I have at least 3 portfolios that are for sale right now. If you join before we sell those portfolios, you get a free license under those portfolios for life. If you join after we sell those portfolios, you miss that opportunity. And that's something we're on a constant cycle of. Reduction in risk, yeah, that's the same of both. The scope of the risk is very different because we go beyond just the standard, the Linux standard. And patent pools are just a reduction of risk in the standard they address. As I mentioned, OIN, the cost of membership is 0. Very different than a patent pool. There's no patent pools that are 0. We address the overwhelming concern of Chinese industry and government. We have no fees and no royalties. You can't get cheaper than what we offer. It's free. To get cheaper, we would have to pay you to join. And that's not going to happen. We promote this concept that Keith touched on about co-opetition, which is really consistent what a patent pool works on. The idea is that you need to cooperate at a common area, right? That's how you make ubiquitous adoption. That's why Linux, when Keith put up the slide of all the Linux projects, 10 years ago, there was a lot of white space on that page. There were not a lot of Linux projects. Now, there are many, many open source projects around Linux. Every one of your companies is doing something that relates potentially to something that Linux is supporting. And that's because there's been virtually no litigation around Linux. Virtually none. There's a couple of companies that are well known that have asserted some Linux-related patents. But when you look at this history of technology, there's been almost no technology that has had so little litigation around it as Linux. Now, we won't take all the credit for it, but I could tell you that OIN has a pretty big role in making sure that that environment happened, which allows your companies to develop more cheaply, quicker, more securely, with more confidence in QA solutions. And that's why you need to support OIN, because ultimately it benefits your companies. Our obligation of membership, just to go over what I touched on, all members agree to cross-license other members under patent claims, right? Not just patents, but patent claims that directly read on the functionality captured in the OIN Linux system definition, but only for use in Linux. So, for example, you have a patent claim, and it reads on Linux, and it reads on Microsoft. You're not licensing the Microsoft portion. Only for the use in Linux is licensed. Very important point. Because when you have to explain it to your business units about what it is that OIN is taking, we're very limited in what we ask for. The scope of that cross-license is set by the Linux system definition. The Linux system definition is, in effect, our standard that our technology group adopts based off of existing Linux packages. And we publish that. You could see it on our website. You could see what the packages are. And the reason that we're able to increase our membership now as compared to 13 years ago is because the Linux system definition is a living, breathing document. Because Linux is a living, breathing document. Remember I said that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was a lot of white space on that page about Linux projects. If we didn't change the Linux system definition, we would have no coverage on specific packages on the programs for Linux that are relevant today. So every 18 months, there's an update to Linux system definition. Under our contract, we have, I think, 60 days to send out notice of what that change is going to be. But remember, we are a voluntary organization. You join us voluntarily, you can leave us voluntarily. If we are not responsive and mindful of our members and their interests, we would not exist. We didn't get to be almost 2,700 members because we disregard the concerns of our members. Now, in actuality, even though we're only required to do 60 days, we send out notice of what the update is going to be between 4 to 6 months in advance. We give a preview of what the change is. We just send out an update. We offer up to all of our patent holding companies. We send out, hey, here's the update. We're happy to schedule a call with you and our technical staff if you're interested, to explain to you what the differences are, what the changes are, so that you don't have to figure it out on your own. We try to make it easy. And that's a process we go through. In the history of Linux in OIN, we've had virtually no companies ever withdraw because of a Linux system definition update. And that's because we balance. We only want to be relevant on programs that people care about, where there's value. Did you have this slide up in your deck, Keith? I don't remember.
I didn't have the financial services.
Okay, so I'm running out of space in this slide. When I started 2 years ago, there weren't that many companies on there. We're starting to have to maybe go to multiple slides. But you could see that we are having some of the biggest companies in the world have joined OIN, some of the biggest patent holders. Notably, in just this year alone, AT&T, one of the biggest patent holders in the world, just joined us in the last 60 days. Over on automobile makers, Volvo, a subsidiary of Geely, they joined OIN. In the last 60 days, we also had Yamaha and Suzuki join OIN. Ant Financial joined us within the last, I guess, 4 months or so, and is really a key member for us. Sugon joined very recently. Let's see, where is it? Meituan. Anybody uses Didi? Well, you could use it without fear of getting sued under Linux system definition patents because Meituan joined. And that's what we're finding is that once companies look at other contemporaries, you get comfort that really there's no trick here. Lots of companies, these are all top companies of the world that have looked at our obligations and our benefits, and they've all joined. In China, here's our representative members in China we highlight, at least, although Sugon should probably go in here. So we have, in automotive, we have BYD and GAC Group and Photon. See that, NIO? Lots of Chinese automakers. Shanghai Auto. We'll be adding you on soon, I hope. Meituan, Ant Financial, TCL, JD.com, Newsoft, all very notable companies with intellectual property portfolios of their own. Oh. We make it easy to join. You all have my cards. You could reach out to me or Keith at any time. But all you have to do is go to openinventionnetwork.com, and right at the top of the screen it says join. I'd say 99% of our members join through the e-sign process. However, if any of your companies need paper copies to go through your approval process, we can do that too. One of the things I wanted to highlight, which is a little bit different than most you see in most patent pools, is the diversity of our members. By categories, you could see we are a very diverse group of companies. The biggest chunk is computer services, followed by business services, but we have everybody down from semiconductors, household appliances, communication services, across the board. One of the questions that came up when I started pitching OIN in China was, aren't you just an American company? Well, no, we're not. Keith and I are American, but that's about as far as it goes. We are a global company. Our board members come from all over the world. There's no country or industry that has any particular ownership over the board. And we actually work out to almost equal parts between North America, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. It's almost a third, a third, a third. It's a very global company. This major benefit of membership, which I highlighted on our difference between patent pools. This $100 million plus patent portfolio we have. Reach out to me. I'm happy to provide you information. We also have it on our website about what our patent portfolio is. We're regularly adding to our patent portfolio. In fact, if any of you have patents you want to sell, we are actively looking to add in patents that are Chinese patents into our system because we want to provide more value to our Chinese members. We recognize that a lot of our Chinese members, their business is primarily focused in China. So the idea that we have so many US or European patents is great, but it doesn't really benefit you. So we are proactively trying to acquire more Chinese patents. We've acquired a number of patents from Huawei, as well as other companies as well. And that's an active program. So we're always looking to acquire assets there. Just reach out to me and we can help you with that. Just to show the diversity of our patents, we get them from a lot of companies and universities that don't typically sell patents because we don't assert our patents. Right? We are companies and schools, typically universities like we have on here New York University, George Washington University, Duke University. They don't typically sell patents because they don't want them to be asserted. They will sell them to us because they know that we don't assert them. That's all I have. Thank you. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take questions. Or yes?
I was wondering is there any conflicts between the patent pool and the OIN regarding the membership agreement? risks, like for example, if a company is like existing member
Yep.
of a patent pool, and will it be a limitation or restriction for that company to join OIN?
No, it's completely consistent. In fact, some of the biggest patent pool members are members of OIN. If you look at companies like Sony and Philips, obviously two huge patent pool members, LG, Hitachi, Fujitsu, NEC, all giant patent pool members, AT&T, KDDI, involved in a lot of patent pools. Our limitation of what is covered by the cross-license specifically says that if a payment is required to a third party, that's excluded. So we were very careful to make sure that there's no impediment. Even if you have an active licensing program, we are very consistent with active licensing programs. What we want to avoid are licensing programs around specific Linux system patents. That's what our goal is, right? There are no patent pools that implicate Linux kernel patents. We're affect the IP pool around that Linux kernel. Yeah.
Hi, Jimmy.
Yeah.
I'm from the US.
Yes.
Actually, we are kind of evaluating the whole agreement internally, and there are some questions here. Since for our patent portfolio, they are scattered, owned by different entities in NEO. So this is the question. Since the license agreement, it will affect all the affiliates.
Right.
So though we are still internal aligned about this, I'm
Right.
not sure what kind of results will come out. And but is there possible that maybe one of the entity can enter into this? No.
So here's
I'm not sure, just
so it's a very complicated question.
Yeah.
We want all of our members to have confidence that everybody is treated equally, right? Every one of our 2,700 or so members has signed the same exact license, including our board members that contributed $20 million. Same license. Our concept is that we don't want to create a situation, not to suggest that anybody here would do this, we don't want to create a situation where a company joins OIN and puts all of their important patents on the side at a different subsidiary and says, we tricked you, right? So for that reason, we generally encourage top-tier companies to join. We just went through this with some very diverse companies, notably Daimler and Hitachi. Hitachi is one of the most, has maybe the highest number of subsidiaries of any company in the world, over 400. Daimler, also, many, many subsidiaries. With both of those companies, they understood that it's about providing consistency in terms of the protection. And so, but you have to be very careful. Being in-house, I spent most of my career in-house, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes when you have subsidiaries that do their own thing, let's just say, maybe rebels to the headquarters. Sometimes headquarters needs to make decisions that are for the benefit of the overall company. When I worked at Sony, I worked for Sony Corporation of America, but I was an extension of Sony Corporation in Japan. And I would oftentimes run into conflicts where Sony Electronics or Sony PlayStation would have their own interest of what they wanted to do. My job as being at the headquarters was to make what the decision was best for the company and reducing the risk for the company. And you simply can't let a subsidiary company impact the risk environment for all the other companies in the corporate ladder. What we found with Hitachi and Canon in particular is that they knew that there were a couple very important subsidiaries that they had discussions directly with to get their agreement to join. They did not go out to their 400 subsidiaries. They recognized that that's neither practical, it's a barrier to have to go out to 400 subsidiaries. Didn't make sense. But they focused on just the important subsidiaries where intellectual property was a key piece of a business, and they sold it. We made some visits to some of those subsidiaries to help educate them into the point. And we also set up meetings with other members. So some of those companies needed, it was very helpful to talk to other members. So I'm sure Ben probably be happy to talk to somebody to explain, no, we were able to decide this was a good decision. People from JD.com or Meizu or Meituan, they're all available. They would all, I would expect, take a phone call and spend a little time to chat to explain to you why it is they reached that conclusion. So we are, the explicit terms of our agreement say that if a subsidiary joins, it binds the whole stream. That's our official position. That said, we try and, while a subsidiary can join, we will still try to get the parent company as a member, because at least on the face of the license agreement, our position we have to take is that the subsidiary joining binds the whole tree.
So we'll do the internal alignment further.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, direct example, Volvo. So Volvo joined. We're still in discussions with Geely to join, right? So under the terms of our agreement, our position is that, well, Geely's bound based on the terms of our agreement because they're wholly owned Volvo. But we're actively trying to engage with Geely to just directly join. Right?
So the Volvo and the Geely, though the Volvo signed agreement,
Correct.
but you're still negotiating with Geely.
Yeah.
So
Geely is
after
other subsidiary.
yes, so after the Geely, if they agrees to the agreement, they will sign the agreement again
Yeah, so Geely will sign on behalf of Geely.
separately.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the same thing is true. We've licensed a Tesla subsidiary, but we don't consider that. Technically, the way the agreement's written, Tesla's bound,
Yeah.
but we'll still get Tesla to sign. It's just kind of like it's almost like a belt and suspenders thing. We just want to, we don't want to claim a victory or a license unless, a company feels that they're going into this with their eyes open. And so it's just something that we do because, and we pay people, our licensing team gets paid an incentive for bringing in, significant companies. So we don't not pay somebody an additional kind of reward for incentive for performing in that way. We want inclusivity. We want people to be very comfortable with their decision. That one of the things that we mention a lot, and then we just did a survey of the top 200 patent-owning companies that are part of our community, and it was interesting because it really resonated with what I've always kind of thought from the beginning in the 10 and a half years I've been doing this, which is that the license is a means to get to something else, which is a set of social norms, a code of conduct as to how we behave and utilize patents in an open source centric world. That's really what this is about, is that code of conduct showed in our survey as the major motivator for people. Not that the patent cross-license was insignificant or the access to the unlimited field of use right to use our patents that we own. But it's really important that when we start to utilize open source code and we start to participate in these communities, there's a set of opportunities and obligations. We have great opportunities to get access to technology. We talked about all the benefits, but the obligation, one of those obligations is to behave well on the copyright side, to maintain compliance, to effort to maintain compliance and be always moving in that direction. But also on the patent side, it's OIN. We don't guilt people, and we try to be engaging and to create the opportunity for OIN to sell itself. Because I love this job because it's something very unique, and I'm supporting something that will be so immensely important going forward to the kind of global harmony. Again, if we work together, we tend not to think about, I was a diplomat in my first career, and it was the Cold War era, and it was about making the world safe for democracy, as corny as that sounds, but I lived with that every day, and I thought about that every day. For choice and for freedom, and it's not democracy as as social movement necessarily, but the idea that people have choice. They can make the decisions to what they do and how they do it. And now I feel like this is a capstone of my career because it's about making the world safe, the democratization of innovation. It's not about the G10 or the G6 countries controlling value. I mean, that model was so broken for so long that we, you know, in America, we still suffer from having the worst mobile phone culture in the world. While everybody here was using GSM, everybody in Europe was using GSM, we're waiting for a homegrown solution by a not a particularly nice company in San Diego. And so we're strangled by Qualcomm. The Koreans were the only ones who waited also and used CDMA. And it set us back because there's a social component to how you use technology. And I'd say we've never really caught up with how the rest of the world uses technology, particularly Europeans and people from Asia. So it's a unique value proposition as we've been describing, but it's really about, are we authentic within the community, and are we behaving in a way that makes sense for us, that whole notion of open and closed? Is our patent program consistent with that? And you get judged, you know, we look at it in Silicon Valley. I mean, some people are, the mobility of humans in that environment, the free agent nation concept in America is no more extreme than there. Because if you're going to do something, you don't sign the OIN license, or you do something that's negative, you file patents even. You look at Twitter. Twitter's the most extreme example. They entered into an agreement that said that it's an inventor bill of rights. They'll file patents, but inventors control the use of those patents. They can't license, they can't transfer, they can't sell, they can't do anything with a patent unless you approve.
It's like a university.
I mean, to think that they did that though because two reasons. One, their business model's broken and they can't generate revenue and top line, which then would allow them to have a soaring stock. Their stock's flat, unlike Facebook. And so the other reason is that they didn't want to lose people. They were hemorrhaging people, and they wanted to keep those people.
So one thing that Keith mentioned is really important to understand. We are about choice. If you join OIN, that doesn't mean that you need to use Linux. That doesn't mean you have to use Linux projects, but it gives you the option. It gives you the option to mitigate your risk proactively if you decide to use Linux. It's about that optionality. And that's really what we're about. Thanks, Ben. One of the big factors in response to your question, really, I mentioned is about consistency, about getting these large companies to join. Their most important concern, and why we've had such a landslide of big companies joining, is because they're all comfortable that everybody is being treated the same. And as long as everybody is being treated the same, they're okay with it. And they understand it. And there's always been pushback. Most companies have some pushback, and then we just keep on telling them, nope, it's all the same. Everybody gets treated the same. You have to commit the organization, and the benefit is that you get the entire Daimler organization, and you get the entire Sony organization, the entire Philips organization, and IBM. You get the entire IBM organization. There's no carve-outs. There's no carve-outs. And it's way more upside.
And OIN has been doing this for 13, 14 years.
Yep.
We are not a new company.
Yeah.
So,
And again, it's global. We're here because open source is exploding in China.
Yeah.
And when I first started talking to Tencent 7 years ago, it was early. There's usually a match where as open source becomes more relevant, our OIN becomes more relevant. And there's an inevitability to open source, and as a result, there's also an inevitability to participating in the community and participating in the community values.
Yeah.
Again, that's what it comes back to, is that if you're going to use open source technology and you're not utilizing and you're participating in projects and you're not covered and protected by OIN, it's almost a form of negligence or neglect to not have that coverage, because these project licenses that so many new projects are done under don't provide sufficient coverage to support risk mitigation and patents.
So I hope we're going to continue.
Wait,
Yeah.
No, very similar questions as this lady, and very clear answers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll be around. I hope you'll all be able to join us for dinner later, so we'll have a chance to.
We have
more.
presentation.
We have more
we have
presentation.
panel, and then we'll.
So if you have more questions, write them down. And
Yeah, what we love is to have things be interactive. We love questions, and if there's something you're even thinking about, there's no bad question. We're here to be a resource. Again, the reason I like what I do is that it's rare when you are not selling something for a living, when you're just doing something that's good. And a big part of it is being able to explain and translate that, having something that's free. The reason it exists is because we are at an inflection point in society in terms of, and those original 6 companies recognized it, and they put out significant amounts of money because they think it's so important that open source be, the opportunity for choice exists. And they're confident enough that they believe that they were going to compete well in an open source centric world. Has it provided significant benefit to Philips? Not really. Philips has very few products that are run on open source platforms except their medical device business. But nonetheless, they recognize that it's an important thing to do to invest $20 million to be able to support this transformation of how innovation occurs.
so we want to take a brief bio break and drink.
We've got some beverages.
Okay, we have some beverages. Why don't we just take a quick break before we go into the next presentation? Everybody could use the restroom if you like, have a drink. It feels like a